I hope you've been having a good month so far, and I am, as obviously as you can tell, I'm pretty excited. I love Easter. I think it's so important to what we do. And my topic for today is called the Sin Eater. The Sin Eater. Now, maybe you've heard of sin eaters and maybe you haven't, but I started to look into this a while ago. And so, and I kind of became I became intrigued by this concept of sin eating. And so here's what it is if you don't know. You know, it wasn't all that long ago that when people would pass away, that they would have the viewings and the funerals right in their homes. There wasn't necessarily funeral homes that they would take the departed to. In fact, in the history of our family, my mom's side of the family has been down at our home for 120 years now, and there has been multiple people that have been viewed within the home. That's where they had the funerals. I'm not really sure. But anyway, in Eastern Europe, what would happen is people would have a family member pass away, and they would have the viewings in their home. And when it came time to take the body to the gravesite, as they were bringing the body out of the house, they would call a sin eater. And what they would do is they would take a piece of bread or a small portion of food, and they would take a small cup of wine or ale, and as they were carrying the body out of the house, they would place the food and the drink on the chest of the deceased. And then they would stop. Once they got out the door, they would stop, and the sin eater would be there, and they would eat the bread, and they would drink whatever the beverage was, and they would say basically a small prayer. And the whole idea was that the sin eater would eat the sin of that person that had passed away, and therefore there would be no problem with them journeying into the afterlife or coming back as ghosts. So it was a superstition, but the sin eater was there to help them go unhindered into the afterlife. And for their willingness to take on the sins of the departed, the sin eater would be paid a small sum of money. And so there was a Professor Evans of the Presbyterian College in Carmarthen, England, who actually saw a sin eater around the year 1825. And he reported, I guess he viewed this man for a while in this community, and he reported that the man who was the sin eater was literally abhorred by the superstitious villagers, that he was considered a person that was unclean. And the sin eater had managed to cut himself off from all the social interaction with other people because of this life that he had chosen to be a sin eater. And so he lived, as a rule, all by himself in a very remote place. And when people would happen to chance to meet him, if they happened to run into them, they would try to get away from him as quick as possible. They would try to avoid him as you and I would try to avoid a leper. And the unfortunate individual was often thought to be in association with evil spirits or practicing witchcraft and incantations. And it was only when someone died that they would seek the sin eater out. And then when his purpose was accomplished, when he had consumed the food and the beverage that had been laid on the body, when he had taken that in and had consumed the sins of that person, they would often take the wooden bowl and the wooden cup and they would burn them rather than touch them again, because the sin eater was considered to be unclean and unholy and terrible. And so I know that's all kind of morbid. I know that's all kind of morbid, maybe a little squeamish. If you're a little squeamish, what I just said might bother you. But all of this sin eating made me start to think about Jesus and his death on the cross and the resurrection from the grave. And as often is the case with traditions and rituals and superstitions, there are certain parts of this superstition about the sin eater that are actually founded in truth. And so here's one of the things that is kind of founded in truth. The sin eater's job was to help ease the transition into the afterlife that an individual's sin blocked. He was to ease the transition into the afterlife that the individual's sin blocked. And so there's a portion of truth in that, because the Bible teaches us that unless something is done about it, a person's sin is going to affect the outcome of where they spend eternity. So there's a portion of truth in that. And then another thing in this account given by Professor Evans of how people treated the sin eater, and it reminded me that sin has an undeniable effect. Sin is something that is ugly to look at. And when we see the effect of sin and we see the inevitable consequence of death that comes with it, there is a revulsion that rises up inside of us. And let's be honest, we will do anything to avoid dying because we fear death. But what we forget is it's sin. It's the sin that we commit that brings about that death. And so there is this recognition that just as they didn't want to touch the sin eater or have anything to do with him, that sin is ugly and it makes us sick on the inside. And then also, Dr. Evans, he brought out how the town people just really avoided any interaction with the sin eater of their day. And that rejection reminded me of what the Bible teaches us about Jesus on the cross when he took upon himself your sin and mine. And we know the story, right? He willingly received on his shoulders the weight of our wrongdoing. The Bible teaches us that in that moment, when he bore the penalty for our sin upon the cross, God the Father departed from Jesus. God the Father departed. The Father would not look upon sin and therefore could not look upon his Son who was bearing that sin. And so that sweet friendship, that union that the Father and Jesus had experienced for all eternity, the awareness of the Father's presence in his heart as Jesus walked as a man upon the earth, all of that was stripped away from him as he bore the full weight of sin upon his shoulders. And in the shock of that moment, you'll remember Jesus cried out from the cross, "Father, where are you at? Why have you forsaken me?" In that moment, that sin that is so ugly to look at, the Father turned away. Just like the ancient Europeans turned away from looking at the sin eater who carried it. Now, in ancient Europe, the family members were willing to pay a sin eater to take on the sins of the departed. And there's some truth in that superstition as well, because the Bible teaches us that there is a cost for the removal of sin. There's a cost for the removal of sin. But the difference is, instead of you and I paying for our sin, it was Jesus who paid the price for our wrongdoing. As he hung with his hands and his feet nailed to a wooden cross in literally the most humiliating and excruciatingly painful execution that had been contrived at that time. And so he paid the price for that sin. And here's something else. The people of ancient Europe, well, they would pay the sin eater because they had a fear of the unknown and what eternity would hold. They had a fear of the unknown. They paid money in the hopes that it would give them peace of mind for something that they couldn't see and something that they didn't understand. But Jesus, who's the real sin eater, he paid the price of sin for us so that we could know our future. So we could have peace here and now before we cross the threshold of eternity. The sin eaters were paid money in the hopes that something would happen for the future that they didn't see. Jesus paid the price so that you could know what your future is. Do you see the difference? One was paying in the hope that something good would come of it. The other one was paying so it would definitely happen for good in our lives. But maybe the greatest difference between Jesus, the real sin eater, and those superstitious participants of long ago is what happened after the sin. After the sin. And when we use the Bible as our reference, here is where we begin to clarify the biggest difference between truth and superstition. So I'm gonna lay a little groundwork here. And some of this is going to be pretty doggone familiar for us, I would assume. Because let's start this way, though. Throughout the Bible, God enumerates and clarifies right and wrong actions. Throughout the Bible, God makes it clear what is right and what is wrong. The Bible speaks clearly about what is moral and immoral. It speaks clearly about the actions that are obedient or disobedient to the laws that God formed at the founding of the world. And then the Bible also clearly defines the blessings of keeping God's law, and it defines the penalty of breaking God's law. Now, in my mind, the most succinct statement of what happens when we break God's law is Romans 6:23. This is what it says. The wages of sin is death. Many of us have seen that. It doesn't really get much plainer than that, does it? If you sin, which means to violate or break God's law, if you sin, the punishment for that is death. You will die. Now, on the other side of the law, on the other side of that same law is this. First, there's the law that says if you break the law, you will die. Now, here's the other side, though. If you do no wrong, you're innocent and cannot be punished. If you do no wrong, you're innocent and you cannot be punished. If you do not sin, death has no legal hold on you. A person who has not broken the law of God is undeserving of the punishment that is reserved to a lawbreaker, right? If you stop at the stop sign, you don't get a ticket. If you run the stop sign, you are a candidate to receive that prize, right? Same thing. When we break God's law, we receive the punishment, which is death. If you don't break God's law, you're innocent. No punishment is given out. Now, according to biblical law, or what I should say is the Bible teaches us that while Jesus walked on the earth, he lived a righteous and pure life before God. He never broke God's law. He never broke God's moral code of conduct. Therefore, in the spiritual court of law, Jesus was found innocent of all wrongdoing. He hadn't done anything wrong, and therefore he was not a candidate for the punishment of death. Now, folks, you've heard all this before. Listen to what I'm about to say. According to biblical law, if you don't sin, you don't die. According to biblical law, if you don't sin, you don't die, because death is a punishment for sin. That means if you don't sin, you live forever as God does. If you don't sin, you don't die. If you don't sin, you live forever as God does. You with me? Now, Jesus didn't break God's law. He didn't sin, and so he could not be held by the power of death because there was no legal precedent. And God, who's perfectly righteous and just, found Jesus innocent of wrongdoing. Therefore, it was his legal right to live forever. Jesus didn't have to die because he had done nothing wrong. It was his legal right to live forever, but it was a right that he laid down because of love for you and I. Because he was found innocent of sin and undeserving of punishment. Here's where the legality of it is. Jesus is the only one who can legally take the sin of another person and not be destroyed by it in the process. And that's what Easter and resurrection are all about. That's why Jesus came back from the dead and others don't. That's why when you and I die, we stay dead, but Jesus didn't stay dead, did he? He went into the tomb, and 3 days later he rose again because death could not hold him, because he had never done anything to actually deserve the punishment for breaking God's law. And so he was able to take your sin and mine and the entire world's and pay the penalty that we deserve and come back to life because there was no evidence against him. There was no evidence to convict him of breaking law, and so the punishment was revoked. And Jesus took our sin. He died the death we deserve to pay our penalties, and he opened the door to eternity with God in the process. Now, I can just look out at you, and I can just tell by your faces that you've heard all of this before. This is old hat. I mean, we know this stuff, right? We've been listening to Jim, you're nodding your head, right? We've heard this so many times, boy, we could write it backwards, right? I mean, that's where we're at. You've heard it before. In fact, you've had difficulty not tuning me out. You've had difficulty keeping with me because, well, I've heard it all before. Another Easter service. We've grown up hearing about Jesus living without sin and not deserving to die. And we've probably all gone to enough Easter services now that we at least grasp on some level the enormity of what happened when Jesus rose from the dead and came out of the tomb that had been laid in. We kind of get it. That's why we're all here today on Easter Sunday, because this is the day that we at least kind of get that something fantastic happened and maybe we should do something with God on this particular day. So we kind of get it. That's why we're all here today. But there's one more truth about the legend of the sin eaters that I want to point out to you, and I want to begin it in this way. You know, after studying about the sin eaters, I came to realize something, and it's something about being a pastor. And so I've been a pastor now, some of you know, I've been a pastor now almost 20 years. And through the years, I'll get calls from funeral homes and things like that. And sometimes pastors and ministers, we are called to be modern day sin eaters. We're called to be modern day sin eaters. We're called out of the blue when a person has died and we don't know who they are, but their body is lying in a funeral home and the family calls in the hopes that the minister will come and perform a memorial service. And we'll come and we'll perform the memorial service, and what we'll do, like that sin eater of old, we'll say the magic words that will help the deceased get into heaven no matter what type of life that they lived. And you know, it's very sad for me, and this happened to me just about a month or so ago. It's very sad for me when I talk to these families because I feel their pain. I understand. I feel their pain. I recognize their loss. But so many times I recognize that people are clinging to a false hope. And this is important, so stay with me. Here's the false hope that so many people cling to. The false hope that something can be done to help a person after they die rather than while they live. That's the hope that they cling to. They call the pastor, well, he never went to church. He had all these problems, but could you come and pray over him? And so it's never really said, but it's often implied that the ministers are hoping that that the family members are hoping that somehow that minister can open the door to heaven that will gain the deceased entrance into it. But you know, as a minister of the gospel, I recognize that it's too late. It's too late, and what's done is done. Because what we don't recognize is the opportunity for Jesus, the real sin eater, to do his work is over when someone dies. And now judgment has come in the form of death, because the wages of sin is death. You with me? Folks, the opportunity to have our sin removed happens while we are alive, not when we're dead. The decision to cross the threshold of eternity into heaven and not hell is made while we're alive. And it has to be made by you, the individual. No one can make that decision for you. No, another person cannot make the decision to get you into heaven. Only you can do that. And it must be a choice, our choice, to choose light rather than darkness. So here's what I think the real problem that we face is. Now that I've already reminded us of all the stuff that we've already known, now that I've burned up 10, 15 minutes of your Easter Sunday with stuff that you already knew, let's talk about what's real. And here's what's real, because here's the problem that we face today, and it's the same problem that the ancient Europeans faced, and this is what it is. You know, the ancient Europeans always knew right where to find the sin eater. They knew where the sin eater lived. They knew where he was, but they avoided him. They wouldn't have anything to do with him until it was too late. And you know what? You and I, we know right where to find Jesus, who's the real sin eater. We know right where to find him, but we keep doing our own thing with the hope that we won't miss him at the last moment. So, you know, if we know if Jesus is good for us and that sin is bad for us, why don't we seek out Jesus the sin eater right now? That's what we really got to talk about today. If we know that he is good and sin is bad, why don't we look for him? You know, Jesus was asked that same kind of question, and this is what he said in response, and it came out of John 3:19, and he says, this is judgment. In other words, when he says this is judgment, this is what he means. He says, look, when we look at the evidence that's presented, this is the conclusion that we come up with, and this is what it is. Jesus said this, that light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil. Men love darkness rather than light, for their deeds are evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light for the fear that his deeds will be exposed. But he who practices the truth comes to the light so that his deeds will be made manifested. So whether you recognize it or not, there it is. There's the answer of why, when we know that God is good, there's the answer of why we hesitate pursuing him. Because in our heart of hearts, so many times, we love darkness more than light. And here's what happens, here's what happens. The closer we get to God, in whatever setting that is, the closer we get to God, the more we see our imperfection. The more we recognize our shortcomings in comparison to him. The more we see the sin that we know is inside of us. It's pointed out to us the closer we get to God. And when we start to see that sin, when we start to see evil, when we start to see the shortcomings and the imperfections that are inside all of us, the closer we get to God and we start to see those things, one of two things are going to happen every time. One of two things. We are either going to run from God or we're going to run to God. We're going to run from God or to God. We will either run away from the light that is exposing the evil inside of us because we're not willing to let it go, or as we draw closer to the light and it exposes that evil inside of us, we'll say, God, I need help here. I need you to do something in my life. I need you to help me get rid of this. Here's the question that we need to ask ourselves today. Which one are you doing? Are you running from him or are you running to him? Are you seeing what you are inside and say, you know what, God, I'm just going to kind of do my own thing and be my own man, be my own woman? Or are you saying, you know, God, when I see how I am compared to what you want me to be, I recognize I need help to be that. Will you help me? Which one are you doing today? Are you running from God or are you running to God? So here's my suggestion. Why not let this Easter Sunday become a new beginning for you? You know, as we remember on this day of how life conquered death and how Jesus once again gave hope to all mankind, why not let today be marked as the day you stop running from God? Why don't you let today be the day that you write on your calendar, on Easter 2017, I decided to stop running? Why not let today be the day that you close that chapter on how you've been living without God involved in your life and invite God to begin to write a new chapter of your life? Now, I won't kid you. Following God is not easy. It isn't. And anyone that tells you that it is, bless their hearts, they're lying. Following God is not easy. And at times, God will ask you to stop living one way and to begin to live a new way. And then you have to make that choice all over again, or whether you're going to run from Him or to Him when He gives you that choice. You're going to have to decide that over and over again. Are you going to love darkness more than light, or are you going to trust the God that made you to lead you into a happier, more fulfilled, and purposeful life than you could ever have without His involvement? Following God isn't always easy. But here's the thing. At New Life Fellowship, right here, we believe in new beginnings. Hey, that's why we named it New Life. Get it? See how they connect? We believe in new beginnings. We believe that God can close one chapter and begin to write a new chapter. We believe that no matter where you are at in your life, that God can come into that life. If you invite Him, God will come into your life and He can change you from the inside out. And I am the living proof of that. It can happen. If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. And this church, this congregation is filled with people who are allowing God to write new chapters of hope and strength and direction in their lives. So I'm inviting you today. I'm inviting you to make a commitment to come back and become a part of what's going on here at New Life. Start that new chapter by making a commitment to close one and to begin a new one that God is going to write with your involvement. And you know, we don't always know how every page will turn out. That's the thing about life. Even in the church, we don't always know how every page will turn out. But there's something that we have that others don't. We know how the story ends. And the story ends with one day, I'm going to cross the threshold into eternity, and my Savior is going to be there waiting for me. That's how this story ends for me. That's how this story ends for so many of us. But God wants us to be able to say, He wants to help us now. You see, God doesn't want you to come to Him just so you can get travel insurance for eternity. He doesn't want you to come to Him just so you can book your trip, get your ticket punch. You see, the God that created you loves you and knows what you need to make it through this life in a broken world. And He wants to be involved in your life now, today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, every day. How much? A lot. That's why the apostles and the disciples and the people that followed Jesus, that's why they said back in the Bible, well, in Him we live and move and have our being. In other words, wow, the more I find out about God, the more I recognize, woohoo, this is great. I can't do anything without Him. I don't want to do anything without Him. But you're the one that has to say, I want Him involved. I can't do that for you. Your husband can't do it for you. Your wife can't do it for you. Your parent can't do it for you. Your child can't do it for you. You got to do it for you. You see, the real sin eater, Jesus, has done the work. But the decision of where we will spend our eternity, it's no longer up to Him. It's up to you. It's up to you. He gave you the free will to decide whether to run from Him or to run to Him. It's up to you. And it must be made by you, the individual. And it has to be made while you're alive. While you're alive. Because God wants involved. And He wants to be your friend right now. If that makes sense to you, would you talk to God as we close in prayer? I want you to just talk to God in your own words. However you need to say it. If what I've said makes sense and you want to be one of those individuals today that say, God, I need a new chapter in my life, then as I close in prayer, talk to God. He knows that you're here. He knows what you've heard, and he knows what's on your heart. So don't be afraid to talk to him. Let's bow our heads. Lord, I've lived now with you and without you being in control of my life. Lord, I have spent years upon years doing the things that I wanted, in the ways that I wanted, when I wanted. And Lord, I have now lived years and years doing my best to follow your lead in my life. And Father, when I look back at the track record of who's done a better job of leading my life, you win, no hands down. Lord, the way that you have guided me and given me strength, the things that you have taught me, the courage that you've given me, the hope that I have, Lord, I didn't have any of that stuff before you. And so, Lord, I don't want to live one more day of my life without you. Lord, heaven is good, and I'm looking forward to it, but Father, the way you have helped me every day is absolutely priceless. Father, I don't know about the people here, Lord. I can't read their minds. I can't see their hearts. I don't know their thoughts, but Lord, you do. Father, you say that before they think it, you know it. Before they do it, you've seen it. After they've done it, Lord, it was no surprise to you. You know each and every life that's here, a life that you created. Father, you know that those that are desperate for you, you know those that are complacent, those that are asleep, those that are passionate, Father. And all I can ask on this Resurrection Sunday is that you would come alive in the life of each one. Father, for those that want to close off that one chapter of living without you, Lord, help them to begin to see what that looks like. Help them to begin to see what it means to have you in their life every day. Lead them to places where they can learn about you. Father, when they pray, let them know that you're listening. Father, if they pick up a Bible, let them know that you're speaking to them through your word. Lord, I just pray that you who are a loving God, a loving Father, would touch them when they come to you. Father, for those of us that need strength today, I ask that you would give it to us, Lord. Help us to stay faithful to what you call us to be as men and women of God. We don't want to miss a single thing that you would have us do. And on this Easter Sunday, we thank you for your son Jesus, who died for us. He paid a price that he did not owe. Lord, he paid something that we couldn't pay ourselves. Thank you for this Resurrection Sunday. Thank you for the life that you gave us. And touch these good people, I pray, in Jesus' name. Amen.